Okay, Progressive Era Part 2. I'll keep this down to no more than 3 if I can. um, Second part of this you should be following this on the class notes worksheet. It's meant for you to bring to class and kind of a roadmap so you can keep track of where I'm at in my lectures, which is what this is. So, class notes worksheet, Unit 2B, the Progressive Era. Now, diversity of criticism. Criticism of what? As we left off last time, there was a lengthening list of things that just put people in a bad mood. Some of it was restrictions in the workplace. But if what you're worried about is time clocks and cash registers, you're not catching the full brunt of it because there are people who had it far worse than you. The conditions in factories, the low pay, with which is often blamed on capitalism or the market economy. That factory workers, particularly unskilled ones, could be hired for very, very minimal amounts because the market is setting the wages. And that's not necessarily the fault of capitalism, and it's in that the market, the supply and demand, sets the price of labor, which is the wage. And if the labor market is glutted with hungry, desperate people, that will drive wages down. It always will. It would do it right now today if we opened our borders to a lot of hungry people. And that may sound cold, but it wouldn't really help anybody because the desperate newcomers would work for less than people who are already here and established. Well, let me get off of that. But if labor had been scarce, exactly the same laws of market economics would have driven wages up, as employers would have been forced to pay premiums to get workers. They will always pay premiums to get good workers. You want to improve your odds? Be one. Be one of those. All right. So you have the conditions endured by coal miners, steel workers, that sort of thing. So this didn't look like America. So the people who were raising alarms about all this tended to be what we would now call investigative reporters, posing what would be called exposés, that's a French word, in national publications or large circulation metropolitan newspapers. Now, this mass circulation market had not existed 2 to 3 decades earlier, as you should have seen when you read earlier in the Progressive Era chapter in the supplements. Now it does. So these investigative reporters often brought up stuff that just didn't seem very seemly or nice, and nice people didn't like having it exposed. Theodore Roosevelt himself referred to these reporters as muckrakers. It's my understanding he borrowed that term from an allegorical Christian novel published in 1676 and still in print, entitled The Pilgrim's Progress, in which each character has a name that represents an attitude or an approach. And the muckraker, let's just say that there are no polite synonyms for muck. Some things just get lost in time. So their role in awakening criticism were various exposés, some of them very well done. A few of the muckrakers deserve notice. Maybe our first famous photojournalist was a Dutch immigrant named Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S, I guess that's how you pronounce it. And he published a book which was illustrated with these searing photographs called How the Other Half Lives. This was the first time a lot of middle-class people had been exposed to the reality of conditions for the urban poor. Children sleeping on piles of garbage in doorways, that sort of thing. Allergies are not 100% gone. They're 95, but they're not 100. Sorry about that. So that was supplemented by photographs taken by Riis. You have The History of Standard Oil by a woman named Ida Tarbell. It was a detailed history of the unseemly business practices John D. Rockefeller had used in assembling his commercial empire in the oil refining industry. Of course, she's there to cast everything in a negative light if she can, but this led to court action in 1911. Federal courts ordered that Standard Oil be broken up into a fairly impressive number of oil companies that hung around for a long time. They hung around for quite a while. Um, in fact, Exxon today was once part of Standard Oil, and two or three others were. As of 50 years ago, 6 of the 10 largest oil companies in the United States has started out as parts of Standard Oil. Okay, it amazes me a little bit when I make up a name when making up an option or a wrong option on a multiple choice quiz, and this is over and done now. But there's one where the question was, which of the following was the founder of Standard Oil? And I had John D. Rockefeller, I had Andrew Carnegie, and a totally made up name, Elijah P. Exxon. At least one person chose it. That's the problem with the humorous option. Some people will be drawn to it and it shuts down their brain. Be careful about that. Okay. Um, we're getting into something a little deeper or more serious. What was progressivism not? It's easier to describe it by what it was not than by what it was. All right? It is not an organized movement with an agreed upon set of objectives and an executive director and a national board and all of that. It's not an organization where you join and pay your dues and carry a card. That's not what it was. It was a mood. It was an attitude toward problems in American life. That's what it was. So that means progressives are very hard to pin down because different progressives are concerned about different things, and sometimes they are actually working at cross purposes with each other. There are essentially 3 components to the progressive point of view. None of these, you will note, reference specific problems. What would it take for you to be a progressive? First thing is, you would agree that yes, there are problems in American life. You agree with that. Everything is not 100% perfect. There are problems. That's the first step. It doesn't get you there, but it's the first step. Consider that if you just didn't think there were any problems, you're not going to be a progressive. You're going to say it ain't broke, don't fix it. The second step is to believe that these problems could be solved. These bad conditions could be improved. You're capable of solving these problems, usually through either the application of new scientific knowledge or the application of government power, or both. So you agree there are problems, you believe they can be solved. That's the next step. The third step would be that you as an individual are willing or motivated to get up out of your rocking chair and get out there and roll up your sleeves and see if you can't participate in making life better for people in this country. Check all 3 of those boxes on the form. It's not really a form, I'm being metaphorical. You're a progressive. All right. So, aristocratic people whose only thing they ever really had to do was endorse dividend checks, they're not too interested in this. Working class people aren't that much more interested in it either because they're just too busy keeping their heads above water. It's middle class people liberated from the unending drudgery that life had once required. They have time to think, they have time to look into this sort of stuff. That's why it's a middle class movement. Why was progressivism essentially conservative? That'd be a cue the laugh track assertion for a lot of people. They're not conservative, they're liberal. Maybe. Okay. They're in a way it could be argued that they're conservative because they're not necessarily dreaming of a future utopia. Some of them are attempting to recover a lost and better America that they imagined existed somewhere in the past. That all this stuff, this change, has not been progress. It's been sliding backward. Things have gotten worse for so many people. We need to get back to the good old days. So it was conservative in that sense. Okay, how were early 20th century progressives different from 19th century reformers? You had a lot of reformers in the 19th century, And they the main difference is that the 19th century progressives wanted to work through just persuasion and modeling and local things like that. It did not occur to them, very often at least, that the government could solve problems. They still saw government as more of a threat than a promise. Government power threatens individual freedom. And if you're, calm down and take a few deep breaths, you'll see actually, yes, it does. Don't ask the government to be more powerful. The more powerful the government is, the less free you and I are. What is power if it's not being in a position to force people to do things they would not freely choose to do, or prevent them or discourage them from doing things they would freely choose to do? Can you think of another definition of power in the hands of government? And that has a magnetic attraction on people who want to use that power to try to remold the world into their idea of how things ought to be. Put all that on hold. I'll bring it up in another context later on, planting some seeds here. Okay, another thing about 19th century reformers is that they gravitated toward one-shot magic bullet solutions. Somehow there's this assumption that all the social problems could be traceable to one single central cause. And if you could find that cause and fix it at the root, then you solve all the problems. Naive? Yes, but that's the way they were going. Example, there was an Englishman named Henry George who, in the late 19th century, published an extremely influential book called Progress and Poverty. And George somehow had the idea that all social problems could be traced back to what he called the unearned increment on land. Those are his words. In economics, the word land stands for natural resources in general. And an unearned increment would be if you own natural resources, if you own land and the value of it goes up without you doing anything. Maybe you have land where there are pools of oil underneath the surface and the value of the land goes up, but you never rolled your sleeves up, you never broke a sweat or raised a blister, and the value of it goes up. That is the unearned increment. You did not earn that, therefore you have no right to it. So George's solution was what was called the single tax, and readers of his book formed countless single tax clubs in England and America that to get rid of all taxation except one thing, and that would be a single tax which confiscated the unearned increment. That if property of yours goes up in value, the government has a right to claim all of that additional value. It looks so good, all right? The tax would raise enough money to finance all the operations of government, and there would be more money left over. It could be distributed to the poor, and that would reduce poverty or maybe eliminate it altogether. And since everyone assumed that crime was a result of poverty, you get rid of the crime problem while you're at it. So this had enthusiastic adherents, many of them. It's impractical, completely impractical, because let's say you have some property out here and the value of it goes up. How do you get the money to pay the government the amount representing the added value? Normally, you'd have to liquidate the asset. You'd have to sell the land. Who's going to buy it if the government is going to claim the difference if the value goes up? This was utterly impractical, but vast numbers of people glommed onto it. See what I'm illustrating here is a single cause. Little bit, this might have a little more going for it. Another single cause was alcohol abuse. Alcohol abuse, working class people abused alcohol. That led to poverty. It led to child abuse, neglect, spousal abuse, poor work ethic, all of that stuff. So just get rid of alcohol and we'll be in a utopia. So they tended to gravitate toward what I might call magic bullet solutions. We're going to continue from this point in Progressive Era Part 3.